with these two eighth graders being paired for the science fair. This is in Sacramento in 1981, and their well-meaning teacher pairs a young woman named Lorena Saenz, who's an American citizen, but whose family came from Honduras and El Salvador, and they're undocumented. She was born in the United States just by a couple of months. And she is really smart and really brave, and because of that, and really ambitious, and because of that, she's sort of yearning to be seen and recognized, but it's also quite dangerous for that to happen. And she's paired with Jenny Stallworth, who's like rich and blonde and beautiful and somewhat sadistic. And the mom of this family, Lorena, because it's 1981 and people actually visited one another's homes, Lorena walks into the Stallworth mansion to work on this science fair, and she's immediately kind of set upon in different ways by each of the Stallworth parents, who have a rather unwholesome idea of the role that she's going to play in their lives. And so I'll just read a little bit that's, the mom, Rosemary, says to Lorena, basically invites her on a camping trip, a family camping trip. And they go out to this campsite down in the Mojave Desert, and then it turns out that Rosemary, the mom, is actually not so interested in camping. She would rather stay at the nearby Hilton Hotel. And so Lorena winds up out there with the Stallworth family, with the Stallworth dad, who's a zoologist, studies scorpions. He's a scorpiologist, actually. And he has sort of a surprise for the girls. He takes them out at night, but this involves putting on snake chaps. And the moment Jenny Stallworth realizes that there's an adventure that requires snake chaps, she says, I would rather not participate in that activity. And so Lorena, who's a bit braver, says, okay, I can roll with that. I'll go with the snake chaps. And so I'll just read a little bit of what happens next. Mr. Stallworth, that's the scorpiologist, led them into the darkness. She's gone out with, Lorena is there with Mr. Stallworth and also Glenn, who's Lisa's older brother, who's Jenny's older brother, and he's like a soccer playing jerk, basically. It's the autobiographical character. Mr. Stallworth led them into the darkness. He lugged an oversized lantern, which he set down on a small rise. Close your eyes and keep them shut until I say, do it, Glenn murmured. Oh, okay, open. An iridescent purple light gleamed out in all directions. Lorena's eyes scrolled an ocean of sand upon which now lay scattered scores of tiny glow-in-the-dark toys, the sort kids on TV pulled from cereal boxes. Then the toys began to move. Lorena gasped. These were living creatures, many-legged and scrabbling like tiny lobsters. Welcome to Scorpionville, Glenn said. Lorena glanced at the sand around her feet. A scorpion the length of a hairpin labored under the weight of its stinger, which hung like a fanged jewel over the armored segments of its body. Don't be frightened, Mr. Stallworth said. He was suddenly right beside her. I'm not, Lorena replied. What do you think? There, she cast about for the right words, stunned to find the truth in such a simple one. They're beautiful. She could feel Mr. Stallworth inspecting her face, trying to figure out if she really meant it. He took off his glasses and began furiously polishing the lenses with the hem of his shirt. For a queer moment, Lorena imagined grabbing his glasses and tossing them away. "We going to take any home?" Glenn asked. Mr. Stallworth pulled the small flashlight from his pocket and began and swept the purple beam across the sand. "We might as well see who's hunting tonight." To Lorena's astonishment, he knelt down and guided a scorpion onto his palm. The animal was the size of a matchbox. Its pincers pawed the air. "Shouldn't you have gloves?" Lorena said. "You just come at them from behind," Glenn said. "They can't sting backwards." "They're not aggressive animals," Mr. Stallworth explained. "They just want to be left alone." "Tell her about the dance," Glenn said. Mr. Stallworth let the scorpion scuttle from one hand to the next. "Yes, you might like this. During courtship, the scorpions grasp each other's pedipalps, their pinchers. They perform a kind of dance. It's called the promenade à deux. It looks like they're fighting, but it's just the opposite. It's how they select a mate." "Fuck or fight," Glenn whispered in Lorena's direction. That's the me character, remember. It's me at 13 saying that. "Fuck or fight." His father glared at him. "What did you just say?" "Nothing," Glenn said. Mr. Stallworth aimed the purple light into his son's eyes. "There's a young woman here, Glenn. This isn't some locker room. It was a joke." It was demeaning. "Apologize to Lorena now." Glenn blinked like a scolded dog. Sorry, he mumbled. Mr. Stallworth returned his focus to the animal. You see these little hairs along their legs? He said, this is how they hunt, by touch, by vibration. They can register the movement of a single grain of sand from 10 yards away. Why do they shine? Lorena said. Nobody knows. Fluorescence must convey some kind of evolutionary advantage, but it's still their little secret. Glenn asked his father to find a scorpion he could pick up. Mr. Stallworth scanned the ground with his magic light. These are your best bet, he said. Sand scorpions. Aren't they poisonous? Lorena said. This species isn't too bad. She watched Mr. Stallworth gently prod the scorpion onto Glenn's hand. The creature scampered along his knuckles. It looked glum, menacing, painfully shy. Are you going to pick one up? Glenn asked Lorena. I'm sure she's had enough excitement for one night. I'm not scared, Lorena said. The words came out louder than she intended. More softly, she added, I'd like to hold one. Mr. Stallworth switched on the lantern. He stared at her face again, half in wonder, and picked up another one, bluish under the light, a gentle species, he said. Its sting no worse than a wasp. She reached out, and Mr. Stallworth uncurled her fingers. The earth was trembling beneath her. Then she realized that it was her, and not the earth. You don't have to do this, Mr. Stallworth said. I know. Do you trust me? She met his gaze and nodded, and Mr. Stallworth lowered the animal onto her. No way, Glenn said. He gets the great lines. No way. The creature clung to the knob of her wrist like a charm. Slowly, tentatively, it began to move toward her hand, the legs rising and falling like jointed oars. Lorena's pulse lurched. She closed her eyes to keep from flinching. Tiny feet tickled her palm. She felt a dampness beneath her clothes, the dizziness of what was going to happen next. When she could stand it no longer, she opened her eyes. The scorpion was perched on her thumb, perfectly still. Its stinger hoisted like a tiny scythe. He appears to like you, Mr. Stallworth said. And it just gets creepier. So we will stop there. I promise you it gets super creepy, but I'll stop it there.
Okay, well, since you stopped at creepy,
I will
start at sad.
Okay.
And hi, everyone. I've been smiling at you behind my mask. Thank you for being here. I think everybody, especially in this audience, is probably pretty vividly aware of the anniversary of George Floyd's death today, his murder, and then also, of course, the school shootings yesterday and just the heaviness of this world. And I just wonder if you want to talk, especially someone who's just written a social novel.
Yeah.
You can be honest, as you are. How art right now? How does anyone make art? Why? What do you know what I mean? How do we celebrate it and keep doing it in the context of this glum that we can't ever seem to? Glum is an understatement.
Yeah. So there's a name for this, it turns out. The poet, Wallace Stevens, in his wonderful essay, The Fury and the Sound, writes about what he calls the pressure of the real. And the pressure of the real is the unending series of bad news. It's sort of the news cycle. And what it's not intended to do, but what it has the effect of doing is crushing the imagination or making art seem frivolous or pointless or like some luxury we can't afford and so forth. And it's real. I mean, when I started this novel in 2014 and I got about 250 pages in, and then the 2016 election happened and there was a certain pressure of the real, and it just squashed I couldn't stay in this world because it is a fragile thing, especially in a novel, which is an entire imagined world. And I wrote a book trying to explain to myself and my children, whoever else would listen, kind of what I thought led to the 2016 election. And then wrote another nonfiction book because I couldn't get back into the pressure of the real. It was too great. I couldn't get back into this world. But interestingly, when I finally returned to this book and started reading it, I realized, oh, actually the story I'm telling is really important because it's partly about, maybe it is heading towards, it was always heading towards, an examination of what immigration is in this country, which is really criminalizing the American dream. That's just it. anybody who's lived on the border or just thought about it for 5 minutes knows nobody leaves their home and travels long distances in a dangerous and destabilizing way, sometimes dragging children, unless things are pretty bad and they're hoping things are going to get a lot better. I think part of the reason, I know I'm a little bit off topic here, but I think part of the reason that there's such profound animosity towards immigrants in some quarters of the country is because they simply believe more purely in an idea of America that for some people in the culture is not coming true. They feel their own cultural utility and their sense of meaning and purpose diminishing. And it must be unbearable for them to encounter people who believe so purely in the American dream. And so I realized, like, when I returned to the book, like, holy cow, the journey that one of the characters has to make is actually the same journey that people were making in 2018 and 2019, and when they reached the United States government in our name and with our tax dollars was separating those families with like little kids being removed, traumatized refugee children, to put it more precisely, were being removed from their parents and guardians, and it was like, wow, who have we become? And I could and did write about that in a nonfiction way with all my various lectures, but I don't think that really lands with people in the way that stories and poems land with people. Because stories and poems involve us emotionally, and if they're any good, are not really about announcing the author's noble belief systems. They're more about leading the reader into their own moral confusions and making them feel implicated in, for instance, the national project of being an American. So I know that people have this feeling, and I have this feeling of like, wow, if you just allow that pressure of the real to kind of get you confused and mixed up, then you feel like, oh, I'm not allowed to imagine or wander. But in fact, what's the point of having a democracy, or a society for that matter, if you can't do that? As well as Stephen says, why are you fighting wars if it isn't to preserve the capacity to wander and imagine and create? Like, what's the point? Are we all just economic integers at that point? Has capitalism done that thorough a job on our souls? So you have to kind of remind yourself that your job is to be human, and part of that is being in distress, but part of that is also making stories that are a productive engagement with things that you find bewildering and frightening and upsetting and so forth. And that can happen in the form of journalism, can happen in the form of beautiful photographs that are taken, films that are made, songs that are created. That's the good stuff that human beings get to do. And it has the capacity to make people think and feel more than they did before. And that is part of what gets people to be hopeful and active rather than passive and cynical.
And also fun, I should say, it seemed at least from reading this book, which was a complete page turner. Have any of you read it yet?
What's going on here?
Literally. Really.
There was homework.
Like, it is a cliche to say I could not put that book down, but I'm here to tell you I'm a very sleepy individual all the time, and I can put books down often. And
sometimes she lands on books.
It is a really wonderful thing to find a book that is so immersive to you that you don't want to go to sleep, and that you don't want to put it down, and that when you wake up in the morning you're thinking, can I take the morning off to get through this book and catch up on work later? That was this book, and it's got heavy stuff in it, but it definitely had this sense that you were writing propulsively and that writing was fun for you.
Yeah,
Not that
for
there's not heavy
once.
stuff in it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to students in this class. We were a wonderful class about like what it feels like to work on a novel that is not giving you energy back. It's terrible. You know, you're just pushing and pushing and pushing and hoping the characters will bump into good stuff. It's not a very efficient way of writing, and it's quite. You can feel that you are laboring. And the experience of this novel, partly because I think the muse walked Lorena into my life, and she was I just loved and admired her so much immediately, and she was so vulnerable, but also so brave and kind of beautifully foolish in her bravery. I just had the feeling that I was chasing her. And everything that she did set off a chain of consequence. And that was a new idea to me. I've been writing these terrible novels where like, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and those are not very satisfying. They feel, ultimately, they feel unmediated. I didn't realize that I needed a therefore and because in between those events. This happened, therefore this happens, and because of that, this next thing happens. And once you hook into that chain of consequence as a writer, then you're just chasing it. And it's very gratifying.
For the folks in this room who don't know, how many novels before this one that you decided you weren't happy with?
4.5. Really better than Ativan. I promise you, these were snoozers.
So what did you first know about Lorena, like when she, because I've heard you say this multiple times now, she came to you, and you were just, sort of just taken by that character.
Yeah.
What pieces of Lorena were you certain about, or at least crystallized for you first?
Well, I think actually it's weird that it's weird the way the subconscious works. Part of the reason that we can't let the pressure of the real kind of crush our sense of wonder and wandering is because, man, the unconscious, the artistic unconscious is like our engine. Everything beautiful that arises from us, I think, doesn't arise from our dutiful effort to make it so, but from some capacity to let it be so. And so for instance, like scorpions, because I had that experience as a young reporter in El Paso, Texas, like going out into the desert and having these crazy scorpiologists like illuminate scorpions, and I was like, blah! There's an invisible world all around us. What we think is just sand is alive with creatures who are ancient and who we feel are very alien, but who are actually unbelievably similar to us. We all want to be seen and regarded and set aglow. And also, for people who are like Lorena, vulnerable in very particular ways, that act of becoming visible is very dangerous to her and especially to her people. And this hadn't occurred to me, and it sort of helps to say it, but it probably won't help much with the next novel. Part of what I realize is that your job is to understand the internal conflict that your character has before they even start the story. They bring it with them. And for Lorena, that was, I am desperate to be seen and regarded and even desired, and I mustn't be seen. I mustn't become visible. So I think that conflict was driving so much. And when the scorpions arrive, I was like, oh, thank you, artistic unconscious. That's how a scorpion is, right? They are set aglow almost involuntarily. And at the same time, the actual reason for that, as Lorena proposes, because she's got such a brilliant scientific mind, is that it's an alarm system. They're trying to hide because they view themselves to be prey, to be the victims, to be the ones who should be frightened, which is also very human. We walk around being destructive and telling ourselves a story in which our destructiveness is actually only a reasonable defense against a world that's out to get us, right? And when that really metastasizes, we get the kind of eugenic hysteria that we're living in the midst of.
There's a lot of power dynamic in this book on so many levels, and some of it is in being seen.
Right.
And it's got there's this sense of power for good and power for less than good, and some of the power for good happens through narrative, through a teacher who sees Lorena.
Right.
I'm going to be really careful not to spoil plot, which is also a really unfamiliar territory for me.
Okay.
What is this plot that we're trying not to spoil? But then you also do this sort of dichotomy with all the different belief systems. So there is astrology, there's science, there's faith, all these different belief systems. And it was interesting to me that narrative seemed to hold the power for good in many ways. And these belief systems didn't seem to hold up quite as well. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, but I also think that, we choose belief systems, we tell ourselves a particular story to justify behaving as we wish to behave and not feeling bad about it. Nobody is the villain in their own story. Everybody's always the victim, right? And I did not want to flatten anybody out. And I mean, again, the social novel is intended to say, here are these bigger systems in which individuals operate, and in some ways they're really not, they're trapped in a certain way. The police officers, for instance, in this book, aren't bad people, but because of their particular history and because of the system around them, they make some pretty lousy decisions. Nancy Reagan, who is a major character, at least a pretty important character in this novel that I have written, which if you had predicted or told anyone, and especially me, as recently as 5 years ago, I would have laughed for a week and a half, because I've spent most of my life amid my own liberal bigotries thinking, oh, Nancy Reagan, the modern Marie Antoinette, that astrologically, ditzy, Gucci, drunk idiot, Nancy Reagan, ha ha ha, the punchline. But it turns out that when I thought a little bit more deeply about Nancy Reagan and refused to just write her off in that way, like her husband got shot, and she loved her husband a lot, and she believed he was destined to lead the country, and even if the myth that he was selling, the mansion on the hill, was really unexamined and even fraudulent, because you never ask who lives in the mansion or who cleans the mansion or who gets arrested if they trespass, right? But she believed in his destiny, and she loved him a lot. So when he gets shot, she goes to astrology. She goes to astrology not because she's dumb or mean, but because she's frightened. She wants to keep her beloved safe. And I kind of feel like everybody in this room would do the same thing and has. We will adopt whatever belief system makes us feel safe, makes us feel that we're going to be able to get through it, makes us feel okay about our behavior.
And yet those belief systems come with power.
Yeah.
So that can be harmful, as was
Right.
Nancy Reagan, without spoiling anything.
Oh yeah, she is, that's right. But the tragedy is not that people cackle and go, ha ha ha, I get to be the villain,
Sure.
but that they're completely unaware
Yeah.
of the effects. They haven't bothered to think about what might happen. They really, and I think we do this all the time. Have you ever sat in traffic and been like, God damn this traffic? And not for 1 second realized, I am traffic. I am a part of this traffic. This traffic's actually me. I think it's a very natural thing to
Sure.
kind of like
Yeah.
subtract our own
Sure.
bad
Yeah.
behavior from
Yeah.
the equation.
Yeah. Well, speaking of bad behavior and the U.S.'s criminal legal system, this book.
Smooth
this,
segue.
This book deals with the sort of brokenness of that system, and as it happens, Steve was meeting with a class of mine yesterday, I guess. Time has warped, but that was just yesterday, right?
That was
That
so
was
many years ago. It was
yesterday.
yesterday.
For many hours at Faribault, the prison out there, and met with this group of writers and editors and readers who had read this book, and I was a little bit nervous about how they were going to respond to the aspects that deal with the criminal legal system.
Mhm.
And they read it and they talked about it, and they were pretty much like, "Yep, that seems about right, Steve. Nailed it." And my question to you is, how did you do that? What sort of research did you do so that you could
Yeah.
bring it into a prison and have everyone?
I went away for 5 years. No, I didn't. I was a reporter for 7 years before I kind of went over to writing fiction, although I've kind of returned to reporting when it's been helpful in my writing. And so I spent a fair amount of time, I visited some prisons, I spent a fair amount of time with police officers and looking through long criminal cases. I wrote about a case in Miami. I was an investigative reporter in Miami for 4 years, and I was like the world's worst investigative reporter. To be an investigative reporter, you have to be poised. You have to know that you are going to get somebody on the phone and you have some bad news for them, and that bad news might involve an indictment. And I was not about that. I was so nervous the whole time. I was like, I just want to ask you a few questions. And I think I have bad news. And I was way too anxious for that gig. But it did cause me to spend a lot of time thinking about the larger incentives and the kind of groupthink that prevails in a criminal case, and especially the way that the media can craft a certain narrative based on a myth, and then it becomes necessary for the criminal justice system to make somebody the perpetrator. In the case of my journalism, it was this guy named, that they called the Bird Road Rapist down in Miami. The Bird Road Rapist was the name, the kind of slogan name, the tabloid news name given to somebody or somebodies who committed serial sexual assaults in and around Bird Road over the course of about a year and a half. And boy, once there's a name, in this book it's the Death Valley Killer, once the media gets a name and a logo and starts branding it, somebody's going to have to pay for that. And in the case of the Bird Road Rapist, it was a guy named Louis Diaz, who was a Cuban-American immigrant, fry cook, stunk of garlic and fried food, which not a single one of the victims identified. I mean, he smelled of it all the time, no matter how much he showered. He was also about 5'1", and most of the victims identified the perpetrator as being at least 5'8". There was no physical evidence. I looked at this case file from 20 years distance, and I was like, holy cow, there is no way they convicted this guy. Well, they did, and he went away for 26 years. And then they tested the DNA, and he was innocent, as everybody who had looked at the case in any kind of thoroughness. And the lesson of that isn't, oh, the cops were so mean, or the prosecutors were so corrupt. It's how much, when you're part of a larger system, how easy it is for us to be swayed. You look at what's happening in this country, you look at what's happened in other countries that have fallen away from democracy and the sort of principles of the Enlightenment, and you say, oh, how could it have happened? And another part of me says, how could it not have happened, given how easily swayed people are? So I think part of that is maybe the journalistic background. And I didn't do a ton of research, I will admit, because in the past I buried myself in research as a way of hiding from the writing. This time I just did enough. I just found out enough about scorpions to go, ooh, I like that. They have little hairs on their legs, and they're super, like they can feel a grain of sand move at 10 yards, and they like, oh really? That sounds to me like being around my kitchen table with my family. That's a description of human beings, actually, and how sensitive we are, right? So I did not like bury myself in research, which I had with previous novels.
Svi or whatever his name was.
Svi, right?
Svi.
Yeah, the
That
terrible
guy.
false messiah. Yeah. I wrote a historical epic. You will not want to know. And it was like 850 pages, and it was just packed full of research. In this case, I really didn't want there to be. I wanted to wear the research as lightly as I could, just where it was necessary.
Okay, I hate to do this to you, because if the roles were reversed and you did this, I would be annoyed with you. But I'm gonna ask you about writing as a parent.
Okay.
And I think I can get away with that because you're not a female. Yes, thing? Is that fair? So you've written 12 books.
Not
And
counting the unpublished ones, but
Not
okay.
counting the unpublished ones, so that's what, 16-ish?
Lot,
16
yeah.
and a half? I think when I met you, Steve was my first workshop advisor many, many years ago at a conference in Bemidji. And that was, you had a baby and maybe 3 books prior? Does that sound right?
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever.
I don't know.
Just one big lie.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Once you have children, it's just so blurry.
Can you talk about if there is any difference in your sort of creative life? What's gained, what's lost? Just what happens to your creativity, especially as somebody who's making your living from it?
Yeah.
Pre and post kids, because I'm assuming that there's some writers in this room that are also parents.
Yeah.
Or would be parents.
I mean, there's this, I think maybe it's Richard Ford, somebody who says, every child you have is a novel you don't write. It's just like a super macho, effed up way of looking at the world.
And yet, is he wrong?
Well, he's probably not wrong in a kind of macro sense, but would you prefer to have a book or a kid if you're a parent? Like, come on, there's no comparison. You want the book.
It depends on the book and the kid.
Right. But it's like, it's apples and oranges. It's such a different experience. It's a relationship versus something that you create. And the easiest way of saying it is you just have less time. And if you're parenting, you're being a parent in a way that I think, most parents are trying. You're putting in a lot of effort and a lot of attention. And your effort and attention in life is not inexhaustible. You make decisions about where you're putting that. And there was a time in you read about Vonnegut or Saul Bellow or John Updike, any of the great male narcissists, Mailer, and they weren't doing much emotional tending to their children. And I'm not being a jerk. It's like it's there in the biographies. They were the big deal person who was doing the big deal artistic work, and kind of everything else was secondary to that. And I have moments where, like, certainly my wife says you work too much, and maybe she's right about that, but it's because what she's observing is there is something that's tugging on you, and it's tugging you away from your relationships and family. And anybody who says that that's not a tricky thing to navigate is not being honest. It's hard. You only have so much time and attention to give. And like the books, if you look at it, it's like the books keep getting littler and littler and littler. So they're just really
I
small.
haven't noticed that.
Right?
That's a clever trick.
Yeah, that's a clever trick. Nobody ever complained your book was too short. They're all like, great, 120 pages. Whew, I can do that. But with this guy, part of the reason that I enjoyed it so much is it is a more substantial book, but I sailed through the writing of it. And I realized that I had to get away from the family, because the pressure of the real also applies in a domestic sense. When my kids, if one of them is unhappy, which is true 98% of the time, maybe more, like that's where you are. And so my wife and I have realized that we needed to go find these cheap Airbnbs and go write for a week and say to the other parent, now is your turn to be like everything to the kids. And they always know we're coming back, I think. Right? We don't want to get too cocky about it, but they have a sense that we're coming back. And but it's really, that's the way that I've solved it recently, and certainly for this book, is I just had to get away once every couple of months, and then the other month my wife would be doing that work.
That speed and focus comes through. I think that's the reason it's very hard to put down.
Yeah.
I think the reader feels your sort of intense rootedness in the book, and maybe joy from it.
Yeah. Oh, I had a ball writing.
Did you?
Which is not something that I associate with. I won't say I wasn't like, yay!
Yeah.
But I felt I was really engaged and really curious to see what happened next, and would create even little challenges for myself. At the end of one of the books, Lorena winds up in a place that it seems really quite impossible that she would ever end up. Like, what? How did she get there? And that was really fun, to figure out, well, how did she get there? And to view implausibility not as a problem, but as a source of potential. How would this extremely canny, intelligent person in 1981, without phones that would just give her a GPS location, how would she find a way to convince the adults around her to allow her and aid in her winding up in a place that is almost impossible for her to wind up? So I've really started to have fun with that.
Has anyone told you yet it feels Dickensian? With all the storylines and the characters?
No, I like it though.
Yeah, okay.
Say it again.
It's
Yeah.
always a little scary. You never know if you're going to trigger a writer by telling them something.
Oh my God, what a compliment. Think about, Dickens, God, people, screw Netflix.
Yeah.
Dickens was Netflix and Amazon Prime and all the other ones. People were like, what happens to Pip next?
Right, but you're like, no way. If someone told you the plot of a Dickens novel, you'd just be like, can't work, can't do it.
Right.
But he did, and so did you.
Yeah,
So,
okay. So
congrats.
me and Chaz. Pocket one out.
How are we doing on time? 7:44? Do you want to take a few questions from the
Yeah,
crew
people
here?
have them. They clearly didn't read the book yet.
I have lots of other questions, so if you guys don't have any, I'll just keep learning from Steve tonight.
So you talked about writing 16 novels. How do you go about starting
I
a
love
new
how
one?
it's growing. By the time you guys were did you hear Almond wrote 151 novels? All failed. Sorry.
How do you go back? How do you go about starting a new piece, like a big, How do you do that?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea to say, I'm just about to start a big thing, because you get nervous, you get jammed up by that. And so, interestingly, the sort of how this novel started getting written was the most important step of the process was I said at a certain point, I think I'm gonna stop trying to write novels. I don't think I'm good at them. I think I'm too narcissistically attached to the idea of writing a novel. As a friend of mine pointed out to me, you don't really want to write a novel, you want to be a novelist. There's a difference. Curious and indignant, right? And how accurate that assessment was. And it had become too important to me. And I think when things become too important to our ego, that's another way of crushing your imagination and your curiosity. Because it's not really that you're curious about the characters and what they're going to struggle with and through. You're curious about whether you're charming or literary or smart seeming, or does the reader like you and respect you. All of which are completely reasonable anxieties, but they're not artistically very useful. So I did not say I'm going to write a big thing, but I did say I'm going to stop trying to write novels, because I'm trying too hard, it's not working. And I think that sort of surrender, and it's not dissimilar to what happened with Vonnegut, who tried for years to write his big World War II novel. Years and years, 23 years he tried to work on Slaughterhouse-Five, and then I think he sort of surrendered and gave up and said, I don't know, man, I don't know how to do this. And that opened for him an imaginative space. And the muse will visit you. It does not reside inside you. You cannot choke it out. You can't choke a story from the muse. The muse will appear if you're at the keyboard and you're genuinely curious and humble and you're lucky. This was the ancient conception of kind of what our creative force was. It didn't reside in us. We couldn't just like, sort of do enough crunches and then we have enough writer muscles and then we'd be able to write a great story. It was like, no. Be a little more humble before your own subconscious. You better just sit there and hope that you get lucky and that somebody like Lorena walks in. And once the story has momentum, then I really do feel like the force of the story itself is like this powerful rocket that's taking off. And all of the jets really have this suction power. And what they're doing is they're sucking things out of your unconscious. Memories and events about which you have unresolved feelings, and that's why they're sticking around. That's why we write stories. It's that productive bewilderment. There are things we don't understand yet. So for me, that was walking out into the desert and seeing that there was a world of scorpions and thinking about that and tripping out on that. And it was having an experience at Lorena's age, actually, of having a classmate who went to school one day, and a friend of mine, word went around that Andy Blassé's dad had disappeared. And there was bloody clothes in disarray in his Jeep out on the edge of the desert, and what had happened to him. That happened, I remember. I remember going to his house and seeing his mother, who was a beautiful woman, and her hair had turned white, snow white. And I was like, holy shit. And I never got rid of that. It was waiting for its moment. And the same thing is true of living in El Paso. Now you know El Paso maybe, if you remember from my life in heavy metal, I wrote about El Paso in a story about 20 years after I'd lived there. It was really a story about kind of my sexual idiocy, or the sexual idiocy of the early 20s for me, and mind kind of the crazy world of being a rock critic. And that's what El Paso was. It was just a backdrop. But there were other things that were happening in El Paso, like me witnessing the day maids coming over from Juarez across the Rio Grande in the morning, and seeing those human beings, and seeing them carrying their outfits on their little plastic bags on their head and scampering up the embankment on the American side and peeling back this chain link fence and invading America, and standing there in the dawn, cold dawn, changing out of their wet clothes and putting on their work clothes and hoping the Migra vans weren't going to come and deport them, and then running through the desert and hoping to fit into the street life of South El Paso, and that was their commute. And I sat there with my coffee. Welcome to America. That's how dumb and random our luck is. It's just idiotic. Nobody's achieved anything. You got lucky. I got especially lucky. And that I didn't understand at 31 or 41, but at 51 I started to understand it a little bit more and be ready to write about that. Mm-hmm. But that's the force of story kind of pulls those things out of the subconscious. They've been waiting around for their moment.
I feel mildly hopeful, but also possibly disappointed. Here is why.
Okay.
You said a long, long time ago in the capacity of teacher, or maybe it was in a book you wrote, I can't remember, but essentially, like, you don't have to stress about every single detail. You're not gonna, the stuff you really, really need, you're not gonna lose.
Yeah.
Which I have believed forever, and it just occurred to me. I heard you yesterday mention the name of a student from a workshop that you had 15 years ago, and as you're talking now, I was like, what if that only applies to people who have a good memory? Because I trusted you, and I was like, you know what, that's right, I'm not gonna write it down, I'm not gonna take notes. I love this idea, like, that our subconscious holds the stuff that's most important, but I don't,
Yep.
my son is in the audience, he can attest to it, like, what if really important things in my subconscious should have been written down? Like, I'm just now realizing you have a good memory.
Nope. Sorry, I smoked a lot of pot. I do not have a good memory. But what I have is a normal human memory. And that means that you do hold on to things about which you have complicated and unresolved feelings, which are the interesting ones. And they do take residence in your unconscious. The reason I remembered that student is because I had an intense experience.
That's
As
true.
a teacher,
Yeah.
I had an intense experience with them.
So you're remembering the emotion, not so much the details.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
you weren't as stirred up, but I was like, holy cow, I hurt the student's feelings, and they're
Yeah.
angry, and they're challenging me, and we're
Right.
having a moment.
Yeah.
And if something that had imprinted on you like that had happened, as it has, you told me a whole bunch of stories, you know, about that on the way back. You remember every bit of it.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I mean is not like never write anything down. Write things down. That's good. You should. I'm not saying like, don't worry, man, it'll all come back to you. But what I'm saying is like,
I'm vilifying you in front of your audience, I'm sorry.
But I do think that we write stories about, we're haunted by things. And those hauntings are what stories are meant not to try to solve or resolve, but just to be in the presence of again and maybe have a little bit better purchase on them. You know, my years in El Paso, it's taken me a long time to figure out what was going on there and really try to understand it in a deeper way and put it in the form of a story that helps me understand it and makes what looked to me then like a tragic and bewildering situation to sort of start to make sense of it and make use of it.
It makes sense, that's the social novel's job, right?
Right.
And also, this is a small example, but you talk about sort of terminology that Reagan gave us, the shorthand for all the narratives, like super
Yeah.
predator and that sort of thing.
Right.
I think it's all these years later, we have the distance to go, as your novel does, oh, that's how we screwed up.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, you know, it's a couple of years since George Floyd's murder, and one thing that Reagan said, like part of what I was trying to do, I didn't realize it, but part of what I was trying to do, at least unconsciously, was trace back, how did we get here? And we got here because of a lot of things that, you know, started before we were even a country, but one of the through lines that I found was that there was this idea of a law and order movement, and that Reagan really put forward the idea that the job of government is basically to totally back off and allow corporations to run everything, but the state, and deregulate everything, you know, diminish, small government's good, the less government's the problem, that was his big idea. But what he really meant is when government's in the business of trying to help people, that's pointless. And it's pointless because Reagan believed, and was quite overt, and it made its way into the novel because he gave this speech in which he said overtly, and this I did research because it was so astonishing to me, basically there are certain people who are evildoers. And don't let any social worker or sociologist or egghead academic tell you otherwise. People's behavior are not determined by their social conditions. They're determined by whether they are inherently good or evil. And once you believe that, then you believe something else as well, which Reagan did, which is certain people, meaning people like the stalwarts, wealthy white people, or like me for that matter. It's the job of the state to be very vigorous in trying to protect certain groups, the good, innocent, white, wealthy people, from the people who are dangerous, who are poor and brown. And that is a cultural myth that there's a direct line between that set of ideas and the kind of eugenic psychosis that leads to a bunch of cops in broad daylight murdering a person of color because their head is filled with ideas about how dangerous that person is. It's not a mistake, it's It's not their individual acts of evil. It's a bunch of systems of thought and systems of power in which they operate. When as I was writing, sort of racing to the end of this book, there was Trump saying, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Literally is, a segregationist idea of like what the government should be doing. So I think like I guess this is said in 81, but as I was writing it, it was feeling more and more like I was writing about what was happening right now. And I think good social novels are doing that. Always. You still read The Grapes of Wrath and say, oh wow, holy cow, government can be a force for good in the lives of the disenfranchised. That is possible. The program that you run, even though it doesn't get a lot of support, but you write grants, and that is the government supporting the effort to educate and enlighten and really make minds and hearts blossom in a population that is almost entirely ignored and written off and caricatured. And it's quite astonishing to be in their presence. And that's like, oh, government can be a force for good. We're too damn cynical to admit that, but you read The Grapes of Wrath and you're like, oh gosh, the government's the good guys. Get to the government camp and the Jodes are okay. That's possible. That exists in our history. There was a war on poverty, just like there was a civil rights movement, and abolitionist movement, suffrage movement. Anyway.
Full disclosure, Mike writes the grants. I don't want anything, I'm trying to take public credit for that. But I do want to talk a little bit about teaching, the classroom, but also this thread, again, avoiding spoilers, so, tip my chair over if I'm getting too close to this, but there's sort of a thread of the good that can happen maybe outside of government and just on the human level, on an individual level. And one of my students I noticed pointed it out to you yesterday, this idea of like the way a teacher, or probably any individual actually, can just see another human, just the act of, I think you were calling it regarding.
Yeah.
And my students were loving that. Like, that's just not a word we've used in that way. They loved that Steve was saying that Lorena felt regarded for once. And I think that the impact that had on her narrative is the thread of hope that leaves this book. I don't want to say not devastating, because there's a lot of a hardship in it, but it is the thread of hope. It's the sort of shining glimmer in this, and it's not the government by any stretch. In this case, it's just an individual and another individual and another individual who regard an individual.
Yeah.
And on a more personal note, for those of you that haven't had Steve as a teacher, Steve is one of the very, very best in the entire country. I'm certain of it, right? And so I'm curious, interestingly, I've never heard you talk about the people in your life that have regarded you, whether teachers or otherwise, because it seems so sort of evident that the person who wrote this book has had that experience.
Yeah, for sure. But I also think, but I also think that I had very good fortune in having like parents who regarded me, put it bluntly, and who maybe like when I said I was going to try to write like fiction and move away from journalism, like, okay, go, you do that, you be you, which is pretty rare. A lot of people have to struggle through a lot of resistance within themselves, internalized, but from the family around them. What do you want to do that for? Why do you want to mess up your life in that way? So that's a great bit of good fortune, and my parents also loved reading and novels, and I read with them for a long time, as we do with our kids. And so that's like built into the situation was I had them, I guess, as teachers in a way. I went to really great public schools. I loved my teachers. I would, just if they gave me any good positive attention, I was like, yeah. Like when you get a cat's butt, I was like, yes, this is great. I was in love with all of them. Rosalie Shepherd. Rosalie Shepherd was my third grade teacher, and when our youngest child was born, she came out. We had this idea she'd be called something or other, I forget, but she came out crying. She looked like this angry rose, and I said, "What about Rosalie?" There was Rosalie Shepherd, my third grade teacher. We used to have her over for tacos. She was kind of like, everybody thought she was mean, but she wasn't. She was a total softie. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a common experience, and it's also everybody has, like, that's the thing that I always say to my kids' teachers, like, thank you. Because I feel like, man, that's the work. I have students who are so motivated and so, you know, they are in, they're loaded for Bayer. Neiman's, my Wesleyan students, the students at the Loft, it's like, wow, what a pleasure. That's easy. Try having a third grade class. Those are the people who are like, holy shit, I don't know how they do it, but thank God they do it. So my esteem for teachers, and I'm sure it's coming through in
It
this
is
book,
coming through.
has just gone up and up and up.
Yeah.
As I see it from the side of like, oh my God, somebody has to handle my child and 25 others at the same time. I'm having a hard time with one. So,
5 hours a day, not 8.
yeah.
Or the number of hours the teachers actually keep them.
Yeah,
Just
I
like,
still
yeah,
wouldn't trade
it is a lot.
places with them ever.
What question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing from a lot of authors who are just feeling beat up for cultural appropriations,
Yeah.
which I think is sort of perverted, but they're frozen, you know, and just petrified to write anything. And I'm just curious. I kind of laughed at like the first page of your book. I was like, well, of course he did. So I'm just curious if that conversation has come up for you,
Yeah.
and what you would say to these authors who are feeling so, you know, slotted in.
Yeah.
And most of the ones who've talked to me are, you know, middle-aged white women. Like, that's the group that seems to just be hearing it the most, at least in my experience.
Yeah. Well, the men might be hearing it, but they're probably not listening.
Eating,
Yeah.
eating it the most.
Yeah. I did, so I certainly have had that discussion and thought about it. It will have come to your attention that I am not a 14-year-old Honduran American young woman. That might have occurred to you at some point. Nor am I, you know, a Mexican American police officer, or Nancy Reagan for that matter. The book has this roving point of view, because every time I ran into a character, I got curious about what made them tick and what their stake in the story was, and what were the incentives within them, and what was their history, what was their story. I did not cause a lot of anguish up front. I did not say, I will now write a big social novel in which I'm going to inhabit all of these characters who are way outside my experience, and what's more, they're disenfranchised, and I am writing from a position of extraordinary, almost thinkable privilege. I think that would have been inhibiting, and it just wasn't occurring to me. It's not where I was engaging the characters. I wasn't the commissar. I was like the receiver, the transmitter. And I was much more interested and curious in what happens next. Oh my God, is Lorena, how is she going to get out of this? And in her attempt to extricate herself from this, what else does she get herself into? I was really just with the characters. But afterwards, Laurel, I certainly looked at it and was like, oh my God, I appear to have written a novel that is way outside of my lived experience. And we're in a moment, understandably, and I think really long overdue, where all these voices that have been marginalized and sidelined or just totally disregarded, or at least in the literary world, there's a recognition of like, holy cow, what we consider literature is almost entirely the product of white male imagination and thought and experience. Not entirely, but almost entirely. Still probably 90%. And that's an historical failing that is being corrected. And there are all kinds of fantastic books that are, you know, Luis Urrea's work, Children of the Land, I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. There's all kinds of fantastic books that capture some of the same populations and dynamics that my book does. But when I wrote it, I just wasn't in that sort of business. I was too curious about the characters as human beings and how to kind of understand their experience. Afterwards, I was well aware of that, and I remember sending out to lots of agents, and only one took it. And several agents were candid enough when I pushed them a little bit, like, is appropriation an issue here, and so forth. And one said, yeah, dude, 5 years ago I could have sold this in 5 minutes. I can't sell it now. Sorry, it's nothing personal. I was like, that's cool. I've had way more advantages, right, in the big picture. The reason I was sort of in a position in a million different ways to even undertake this project is because of the privilege that I was born into. But here's something worth thinking about. If we're slotted in to just write about our own experience, our imagination is completely occluded, and we become representatives only of our own experience. So if I was doing that, what would I be doing? I would be centering the white, privileged male perspective. And not only would that be really not boring, but I was not interested in that. And you can't write about things that you aren't urgently interested in. But also, your job as a writer, an artist of any sort, is to enlarge your own moral imagination so that the reader's moral imagination is enlarged. That's like the job of a fiction writer, is to get somebody to imagine their way into another life. And I definitely, there was a more tenuous path to how this book got published because of those considerations. But I don't think I could be wrong. But I think the problem is not in the effort to write outside of your own experience, but in ways in which you fail to do so in a way that's adequately sensitive and deeply enough imagined and felt. So when I read, for instance, T.C. Boyle's The Tortilla Curtain, and sort of was like, oh, and I realized, oh, I don't like how he's writing. He seems contemptuous of all these characters. And it was very clear to me that what I really am looking for is the sense that the author loves or understands and forgives all of the characters. And if they're making an honest effort to do that, and in a social novel to understand and explore the systems of power in which characters are trapped, individuals are trapped, then that's really their due diligence. And it's still true that individual readers can read this and go, I don't like it, I don't buy it, and that's like, I'll take that hit. But at least we can be having a conversation about how undocumented people live in this country, if you see what I mean. Because the central decision that you make as a writer, especially a writer of novels, is whose attention, whose regard am I directing the reader towards? Whose life matters? Whose story matters? Whose inner life matters? And if I did not write about Lorena because I said, oh, I can't, or it's not allowed, or I'll mess it up, then I would be directing the reader towards a much less interesting and important life, in my opinion. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Heidi, who went to grad school with me. But she was a poet. She was in it for the right reasons.
The
I've written poems in years.
Oh, wow! Don't tell me that.
I'm doing nonfiction, but not narrative. And narrative is something that eludes me, and I'm very curious about. You said that you were chasing the threads of these stories through the therefore and the because and following that. And then you also said that where Lorena's story ends up, you were not expecting, or you were trying to figure out how does she end up in this place.
Right.
And so I'm trying to connect those dots. Were you chasing it all the way to an ending you didn't know, or did you kind of know this is where it ends, but I'm trying to follow, like, how does the story get there? Like, how do you, those two parts connect?
So I had a basic idea that I wanted Lorena to wind up in the desert on a quest with another character. And it was clear to me that that was kind of big picture, that's where it has to go. She's got to convince people who are telling themselves a set of bad stories that she's right and it's a different way. And that she might be able to rescue some of her people if she can be successful in that quest. I knew that, big picture. But the individual signposts, I didn't know. What I was really hectoring my students about today is like, you gotta know the big story because then you can relax. And when you can relax, then you have some improvisatory play. You're allowed to explore a little bit. So I didn't know each beat of the story, but I did know that there was this powerful chain of consequence, and I knew that it was headed out into the desert, and that Lorena would be traveling with this police officer in very unlikely ways. They would be this kind of interesting dyad. I knew that instinctually. I don't know how. The muse did that. But I knew that much. Now the end of the book, which Jen has generously pointed out, is even slightly hopeful after some very dark stuff. I knew that it sat wrong with me that Lorena, she was such a junkyard dog. She was such a brilliant and courageous and resilient person that I knew that I wanted her to have a better shake in things. But I also knew that to convince the reader of how that happens, I really was going to have to write like the last 50 pages of the book and and convince myself that there was a path through for her, despite what she'd suffered. I didn't know how that was going to happen at all. And a lot of that was, I know where I'm headed, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get there yet. But that's good. That uncertainty is space for you to explore. And maybe you make some bad decisions and head down some blind alleys or whatever, but okay, that's the creative process. As long as you know where you're headed, I think, for me anyway, I felt like I'll get there. It might take a few runs at it. I might get lost. My GPS isn't very good, but I'm going to get there. And that was very exciting. If I hadn't had that larger sense of where it was headed and what instigated it, and I think I would have been quite lost, as I have been on other books. With this one, I was more certain. So it's like who is it? That terrible band, Hang On Loosely But Don't Let Go. You know, it was kind of that feeling of like I needed the basic story, but I didn't want to know too much or make it into a schematic, because that's not how I work. I need room to improvise. Maybe one more, okay.
I'm curious.
That's Deb, she's one of my needs.
And he's a fantastic teacher. So I hear very much from you the idea of empathy, and I'm curious, as a journalist, and I think as journalists we very much feel like we are trying to be empathetic and we're trying to tell people's stories, but you're right, we often flatten out characters in a way that you don't have to as a novelist. I'm curious if tomorrow you were told you suddenly have to go back to being an investigative journalist, how would you do the job differently now, having now been an author in many different ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question because the Niemans, you guys you've gotten to a very high level in journalism, partly because you know how to operate within institutional boundaries. And you cannot sort of convincingly always make the argument to an editor like, hey man, I need to spend more time with this character and fully empathize with that. It's like, that's not really the gig. So the truth is that it's probably not a crazy coincidence that I made my way out of investigative journalism, because partly what was happening, at least at the newspaper I was working at, was the questions that were being asked were not literary questions. They were basically like, what did this person do wrong and can you prove it? Can we kind of nail them to the wall? And to me that wasn't really interesting. It wasn't a literary question. It wasn't a question that redounded to the inner life. The more interesting question is, why did this person make such a self-destructive decision? Why did they kind of blow up? And that's the province of what I think of as kind of literary bewilderment. That you're investigating these questions that are about the inner life. I do think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, you read these really fantastic profiles like in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or whatever, and there are places, increasingly rare, but there are places where long-form journalism really is thriving. Or the work of Adrienne LeBlanc or Lauren Sandler, or what are these long-form books? We were talking about Anna Fadiman, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. Wow, what a virtuosic and masterful exploration of the Hmong subculture and their interaction with the Western U.S. medical establishments. Astonishing piece of work, deeply empathic to everybody involved. The author, but that takes a lot of time and energy and regard, and therefore resources. And I don't think that journalism right now is so frantic and so eager to kind of capture people with sensation, that it's increasingly rare and difficult for an organ of journalism to do that kind of sustained work. I found it also like, doing Dear Sugars. That was the gig. Was people were like telling us all the secrets of the world. That's what our inbox was. And it was our job not to solve their problems or dispense advice from on high, but to say, wow, that's a struggle, holy shit, to be in that situation. And maybe there's something of a story underneath your letter that you could investigate a little bit more, or certain things you're saying that don't quite line up, and we can make you aware of those contradictions, and we can tell you about a book where somebody's struggling with something similar, or Cheryl will tell you a crazy story about a moment in her life where she was struggling in a similar way, and maybe she learned something about how to handle that situation. but I'm not sure that investigative journalism as I left it is really a place where I could do that work. I'd like to believe I could, but I think I would wind up, you know, giving my editor something and they would say, oh, we can't run this at all.